When my 18-year-old daughter walked into what she thought was a simple family lunch with her grandmother, she instead found herself trapped in a cold corporate boardroom. 6 aggressive lawyers stood waiting alongside my own family, sliding a thick stack of legal papers across the polished mahogany table, demanding she sign away her entire $3 million inheritance. They thought she was just a naive teenager they could easily break. They thought her mother was just a teenage mistake who lacked the power to stop them. But just as they shoved a heavy gold pen into her shaking hand, I kicked those boardroom doors open, slammed a massive binder of financial audits onto the glass, and smiled. "Before you try to steal from my daughter," I said, "maybe you should check who actually paid for Grandma's care." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. "My name is Jasmine, and I am 35 years old. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed my greedy family that day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that toxic relatives deserve every bit of karma that comes their way." I stood perfectly still in the plush-carpeted hallway of Vanguard Wealth Management, listening through the heavy oak doors. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind was operating with the cold precision of the senior healthcare financial auditor that I am. Inside that room, my daughter Aaliyah was facing the most ruthless ambush imaginable. Just 2 hours earlier, my mother Brenda had called Aaliyah crying, begging her to meet for a quick healing lunch downtown. Aaliyah has always had a soft heart. She thought her grandmother genuinely wanted to repair the fractured relationship following Grandma Ruby's passing. Instead, Brenda lured an 18-year-old girl who had just started her freshman year of college right into the lion's den. Through the crack in the door, I could hear the sharp click of my sister Chantel's designer heels pacing the floor. Chantel is 38 years old, the undisputed golden child of our family, and someone who has lived her entire life treating me like a disease she might catch. "Just sign the paper," Aaliyah Chantel snapped, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You do not even know what to do with a brownstone or a trust fund. You are barely out of high school. Uncle Greg and I have actual plans for the estate. We are building a lifestyle brand and we need the capital to expand. Do not be selfish." I pressed my hand flat against the cool wood of the door, listening to my daughter's breathing hitch. I could picture Aaliyah sitting there clutching her cheap canvas tote bag surrounded by adults who were supposed to protect her. Then my mother Brenda chimed in. Her voice was dripping with that toxic weaponized guilt she had spent decades perfecting at our local church. "Aaliyah, baby, listen to your Aunt Chantel." Brenda cooed, her tone sickeningly sweet. "We are family. Family takes care of family. Your mother Jasmine was a teenage mistake who ruined my reputation in this community when she got pregnant with you at 17. I spent years covering up the shame she brought into my house. I raised Chantel to be a respectable woman with a master's degree. Do not make the same mistakes your mother made. Do not be a stubborn, ungrateful girl. Sign the trust over to your Uncle Greg so he can manage it properly. It is what your great-grandmother would have truly wanted if her mind had not been failing her at the end." The sheer audacity of my mother using Grandma's cognitive decline as a bargaining chip made the blood roar in my ears. Grandma Ruby was the only person in our family who saw through their designer facades. She saw me working night shifts, paying my way through an accounting degree, while raising Aaliyah single-handedly. She saw Chantel leeching off my parents and blowing thousands on luxury vacations while claiming she was between jobs for 6 years straight. I heard Aaliyah's voice tremble, but she held her ground. "Grandma left the trust in my name," she said quietly. "She wanted me to have my college paid for. She wanted me to have the house. I am not signing anything without my mom here." That was when Greg stepped in. Greg is Chantel's husband, a 40-year-old white junior partner at this exact mid-sized wealth management firm. He is the kind of man who wears overpowering, expensive cologne and thinks he is the smartest person in any room he walks into. He thrives on intimidation. I heard the heavy thud of a massive legal binder hitting the table right in front of Aaliyah. "Let us be very clear about how this works, Aaliyah," Greg said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. I brought 3 of my top estate lawyers into this room today because we are prepared to play hardball. If you do not sign that relinquishment form right now, I will personally tie this estate up in probate court for the next 10 years. I will file motion after motion claiming your mother exerted undue influence over a mentally incapacitated woman. We will freeze every single asset. You will not get a dime for your tuition. You will not get the keys to that historic brownstone. By the time my legal team is done billing the estate, there will be nothing left but dust. Your college fund will be entirely drained by legal fees, and you will be drowning in debt before you even declare a major. A gasp escaped Aaliyah's lips. It was the sound of a young girl being suffocated by the very people who shared her blood. Do the smart thing. Greg continued, his voice slick with arrogance. Sign the paper. We give you a small allowance for your dorm room, and Chantel and I take the estate. You get to go back to class, and we do not ruin your mother's life with a massive fraud investigation. It is a win for everyone. Here is the pen. I could visualize the heavy gold pen being pushed across the polished mahogany. I could imagine the 3 corporate lawyers standing behind Greg, their arms crossed, looking down at my terrified 18-year-old daughter. They thought they had her cornered. They thought they had backed a helpless teenager against a wall using legal jargon and psychological warfare. They completely underestimated who they were dealing with. They forgot that I spent the last 15 years tracking millions of dollars through complex hospital networks and tearing apart fraudulent financial claims for a living. I reached down and gripped the brass handle of the boardroom door. I did not bother knocking. I did not push the door open gently. I shoved the heavy oak doors open with enough force that they slammed against the interior glass walls, shaking the blinds. Every head in the room snapped toward me. Chantel dropped her phone. Brenda's jaw went completely slack. Greg froze, his hand still hovering over the legal document he had just shoved in front of my daughter. Aaliyah looked up at me, and the sheer relief in her eyes fueled a fire in my chest that could have burned the entire building to the ground. I walked slowly into the room, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not show them a single ounce of the emotion they so desperately wanted to pull out of me. Instead, I carried a 4-inch thick binder filled with bank statements, medical records, and certified financial audits. I walked straight past my mother, who was visibly shrinking back into her leather chair. I walked past Chantel, who was staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. I walked directly to the head of the table where Greg stood with his team of intimidated lawyers. I lifted my binder and dropped it squarely on top of Greg's pristine legal document. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room. I reached over, picked up the gold pen he had offered my daughter, and calmly clicked it shut. Before my daughter signs away a $3 million estate, I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing in the dead quiet room, let us talk about the $140,000 of Grandma's money that you embezzled last year, Greg. The air in the room was instantly sucked out. The 3 corporate lawyers who had been puffing their chests out just moments before suddenly shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused and alarmed glances. Greg's arrogant smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a sickly pale shade of white. His eyes darted from the heavy binder to my face, trying to calculate how much I actually knew. I rested my hands on the glass table and leaned forward, looking directly into his terrified eyes. You really should have checked who was paying for Grandma's memory care before you tried to forge her signature, I whispered. No one moved. No one spoke. The trap they had carefully laid for my daughter had just snapped shut on their own necks, and they had absolutely no idea how deep the teeth were about to sink in. But to understand exactly how we got to this boardroom, how my own mother and sister conspired with a corrupt wealth manager to steal my daughter's future, you have to go back exactly 2 weeks. You have to go back to the reading of Grandma Ruby's will, where the first devastating blow was struck, and where my family showed their true colors once and for all. 2 weeks prior, the atmosphere in the small, dusty office of Grandma Ruby's local estate attorney was suffocating. The air conditioner was broken, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chantel and Greg had arrived 30 minutes late, dripping in head-to-toe designer labels, making a grand entrance as if they were stepping onto a red carpet rather than attending a solemn family matter. Chantel was loudly complaining about the lack of valet parking while carrying a handbag that cost more than my first car. Brenda, of course, was immediately doting on her. She had saved the best chair for Chantel and spent the entire wait time loudly discussing how much they needed Grandma's historic brownstone. "Oh, Chantel, baby," Brenda had said, projecting her voice so the attorney would hear. "That house is going to be perfect for your new lifestyle brand headquarters. The natural light in the parlor is just what you need for your social media videos. And Greg can use the study for his private client meetings. It is exactly what your grandmother would have wanted for her most successful grandchild." I sat quietly in the corner holding Aaliyah's hand. I wore my simple work suit, having just come from a 12-hour audit at the hospital. I did not engage with their delusions. I knew something they did not know because I was the only one who had actually spent time with Grandma Ruby during her final years. I was the only one who drove her to doctor appointments, cooked her meals, and listened to her stories while Brenda and Chantel were busy posting fake family appreciation posts online. When the attorney finally cleared his throat and opened the sealed folder, my family leaned forward with hungry, greedy eyes. They fully expected a massive payout. They fully expected to be rewarded for simply existing. But as the attorney read the legal jargon, their smiles began to falter. The attorney stated clearly that the house, the life insurance policies, and the vintage jewelry collection were not going to Chantel. They were not going to Brenda. Everything, every single asset Grandma Ruby owned was placed into an ironclad trust. And the sole beneficiary of that trust was Aaliyah. Furthermore, I was named the sole executor of the estate, giving me complete control over the assets until Aaliyah finished college. The silence in the room was shattered by Chantel's piercing shriek. She leaped out of her chair, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. "You are giving it to the teenage pregnancy," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my daughter. "I have a master's degree. I am building a brand. I deserve that house." I stood up, placing myself firmly between Chantel and my daughter. I looked my sister up and down, taking in her expensive clothes bought with credit card debt. "A master's degree does not mean much when you have been mysteriously between jobs for the last 6 years, Chantel," I said calmly. Grandma knew exactly what she was doing. An 18-year-old heading to college is a much better investment than a 38-year-old pretending to be rich on the internet. My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You ungrateful brat," Brenda hissed at me. "How dare you speak to your sister that way? We will contest this. We will fight this in court. This is a mistake." But it was not a mistake. And as we stormed out of that office into the sweltering afternoon heat, Greg pulled me aside in the hallway. The friendly, supportive brother-in-law mask he usually wore completely melted away, revealing the ruthless shark underneath. He crowded into my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "You work in healthcare finance, Jazz." He sneered, his voice low and venomous. "I work in high-level wealth management. I deal with millions of dollars before you even have your morning coffee. I can freeze this estate so fast your head will spin. You are going to convince your kid to play ball and sign the assets over to us. Or I will take it all and make sure you are left with nothing but legal fees." I did not blink. I looked right through his expensive suit and his cheap threats. "You can try, Greg," I replied. "But you are going to find out that auditing hospital financials makes you very good at finding where the rats hide their money." He laughed a harsh grating sound and pulled out his phone. "You will regret crossing me by tomorrow morning, Jasmine. Consider that a promise." And that was how the war started. That was the moment my family decided they were willing to destroy my daughter to get what they wanted. They threw the first punch assuming I would just take it like I had taken their abuse my entire life. But they forgot one crucial detail. Having a child at 17 meant I had to learn how to fight the entire world to protect her, and I was about to show them that I had never lost my swing. 3 days after Greg cornered me in that sweltering hallway, my mother Brenda called. She did not call to apologize for the scene at the lawyer's office. She called to demand our presence at Sunday dinner. In our family, Sunday dinner was not just a meal, It was a deeply ingrained institution. It was a stage where my mother directed the narrative and doled out favor and punishment over plates of smothered pork chops and candied yams. I knew instantly it was a trap designed to corner Aaliyah without the estate attorney present. But I also knew I could not let my daughter walk into that house alone. When we arrived, the scent of heavy soul food filled the air, but the atmosphere in the dining room was suffocating. Chantel and Greg were already seated at the table, acting as if they were the king and queen of the household. Chantel was scrolling on her phone, pretending to be bored, while Greg sipped a glass of expensive bourbon he had clearly brought himself. My mother directed Aaliyah to sit right next to her at the head of the table, isolating her from me. I pulled up a chair directly across from them, maintaining eye contact with anyone who dared to look my way. We barely made it through the opening prayer before Brenda began her performance. She set her fork down, grabbed a cloth napkin, and forced a dramatic sob. "I just do not understand how my own mother could leave me with nothing," Brenda cried, dabbing her dry eyes. "I am going to lose this house, Aaliyah. The bank is threatening foreclosure. Your great-grandmother was so sick at the end her mind was completely gone. She forgot to include me in the will, and now I am going to be out on the street." Aaliyah looked up, her large brown eyes full of sudden guilt. She had always loved her grandmother, and the thought of her being homeless was tearing at her gentle heart. She looked at me and then back at Brenda. "I do not want you to lose your house," Aaliyah whispered. Brenda immediately reached out and grabbed Aaliyah's hands, squeezing them tightly. "You have the power to fix this, baby," Brenda cooed, her voice thick with manipulation. "You just need to do the Christian thing. Sign the brownstone over to Chantel and Greg. They have the resources to manage it, and they promise to take care of me. We can fix your great-grandmother's mistake right now. We can heal this family." Chantel smirked from across the table, taking a slow sip of her red wine. "See, Aaliyah," Chantel chimed in. "Even you know it is the right thing to do. Do not be greedy like your mother." The anger inside me sharpened into a razor edge. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward, my voice cutting through the thick smell of gravy and lies. "Grandma Ruby did not forget you, Mom," I said loudly, forcing the entire room into silence. "And she certainly did not make a mistake," Brenda gasped, releasing Aaliyah's hands. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own home, Jasmine?" "I am speaking the truth," I fired back. "Tell Aaliyah the real reason you are facing foreclosure. Tell her about the second mortgage you secretly took out on this house in 2018, the one you drained to pay for Chantel's lavish destination wedding in Cabo, because Chantel refused to get married at the local church. Grandma Ruby found out you risked your own home to pay for ice sculptures and imported champagne while Chantel did not even have a job. She cut you off because she knew if she left you the brownstone, you would just sell it to pay off Chantel's credit card debt." Aaliyah's head snapped toward Chantel. "You made Grandma Brenda take out a mortgage for your wedding?" Aaliyah asked, her voice trembling with realization. Chantel's face flushed a deep, furious purple. She slammed her wine glass down so hard the stem nearly snapped. "Shut up, Jasmine," Chantel screamed. "You are just jealous because I actually found a husband, and you are a single mother who ruined her life at 17. Chantel grabbed her glass of red wine and hurled the contents directly at me. The dark liquid splashed across my white blouse and stained the tablecloth. Aaliyah jumped out of her chair in shock. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my napkin and wiped the wine from my cheek, keeping my eyes locked dead on my sister. That was when Greg stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, playing the role of the calm, rational savior, trying to manage a room full of hysterical women. "This erratic and violent behavior is exactly why we had to take emergency action," Greg said, shaking his head in mock pity. "I warned you, Jasmine." He reached into his breast pocket and tossed a folded legal document onto the spilled wine. "Because of your abusive behavior and clear history of emotional instability, my firm has officially filed a petition for an emergency conservatorship over the estate," Greg announced smoothly. "We are claiming that you manipulated an elderly woman with dementia into making you the executor. Until the judge rules on this, the entire estate is locked." I stared at him, refusing to let him see me sweat. "A conservatorship takes time and proof, Greg," I said calmly. "You have neither." Greg's arrogant smile widened. "Maybe. But while we wait, the court freezes the assets of anyone involved in the suspected financial abuse, including the executor. Right on cue, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an automated text message from my primary bank. My personal checking account, my savings account, and my emergency credit cards had all been temporarily frozen pending an active fraud investigation. Greg had used his professional leverage at his wealth management firm to flag my accounts. He had literally cut off my access to my own hard-earned money. "You have absolutely no resources left, Jasmine," Greg whispered, leaning across the table. "You cannot even buy groceries right now, let alone hire a lawyer to fight me. Have Aaliyah sign the relinquishment form by Friday, or I promise you I will bury both of you so deep in debt you will never recover." Brenda sat quietly watching her son-in-law financially execute her own daughter and did not say a single word to stop him. I looked at the three of them, the people who were supposed to be my blood, and I realized they were nothing more than parasites. I took Aaliyah's hand, pulled her away from the table, and walked out of that house without looking back. They thought freezing my bank accounts would break me. They thought stripping away my money would force me to surrender. They completely forgot what I do for a living. I am a senior healthcare financial auditor. I spend my days tracking missing millions through labyrinthine hospital networks and shell companies. I do not need a checking account to destroy them. I only need a paper trail. While Chantel spent the next 3 days posting smug, vague Instagram stories about claiming her blessings and cutting off toxic family members, I went to war. I stayed awake for 72 straight hours. Because I was legally the medical proxy and executor before the freeze hit, I still had full access to Grandma Ruby's historical records. I requested and pulled the last 5 years of her medical care logs, nursing invoices, and detailed bank statements. I turned my living room into a war room, pinning financial spreadsheets to the walls. I started by tracking the memory care facility payments. My mother had always told the church congregation that she and Chantel were splitting the cost of Grandma's expensive private nurses. But the bank statements proved what I already knew. Brenda and Chantel had never contributed a single dime. Every single payment of $6,000 a month for 4 years had come directly from my personal accounts. I had paid for everything out of pocket. That alone made me a primary creditor to the estate, meaning even if Greg won the conservatorship, he would legally have to pay me back hundreds of thousands of dollars before Chantel saw a penny. But that was just the appetizer. The real meal was hidden in the canceled checks from Grandma's personal checking account. As I cross-referenced the dates of Grandma's declining health with the bank withdrawals, I found a massive glaring anomaly. Over the course of 8 months, during a period when Grandma Ruby had lost almost all of her motor skills and was bedridden, there were 12 different checks written out to a subsidiary investment firm. The checks totaled exactly $140,000. I pulled the digital copies of the checks and stared at the signatures. They were perfect. Too perfect. They matched Grandma's signature from 10 years ago, not the shaky, illegible scrawl she possessed in her final year. Someone had forged her signature. I dug into the subsidiary firm that received the money. It was a high-risk cryptocurrency portfolio managed by none other than Vanguard Wealth Management. Greg's firm. Greg's specific department. My heart hammered in my chest as my fingers flew across my keyboard, pulling public market records for those specific crypto assets. The portfolio had completely tanked. The $140,000 was gone vaporized in a market crash. But I knew a man like Greg did not risk his career just to steal $100,000 from an old lady. There had to be a bigger hole. I used my audit software to run a shadow trace on the corporate filings associated with Greg's junior partner ID. It took me 12 hours to bypass the firewalls and find the public disciplinary filings his firm was trying to keep buried. When the final document loaded on my screen, the entire puzzle snapped together with terrifying clarity. Greg was not just greedy, he was desperate. He was currently under internal review by his own firm. Over the past 2 years, Greg had secretly embezzled $800,000 from his high-net-worth clients to cover his own disastrous personal investments. The firm had given him until the end of the month to replace the missing client funds, or they were going to turn him over to the federal authorities. He was facing federal prison. That was why they were so desperate to get Aaliyah to sign over the $3 million estate. Greg needed to liquidate Grandma's brownstone immediately to pay back the clients he robbed. He was using my mother and my sister to facilitate a felony, and they were too stupid and too greedy to realize they were acting as his accomplices. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. Greg had brought a knife to a gunfight, and I was sitting on a nuclear arsenal. The waiting room of Mr. Sterling's estate law office smelled like stale coffee and old leather. It had been exactly 2 weeks since we buried Grandma Ruby, and the heavy weight of grief was still settling deep in my chest. I sat on a stiff mahogany bench holding Aaliyah's hand. My daughter was wearing a simple black dress, looking so young and fragile as she stared down at the intricate pattern of the waiting room rug. I wore my tailored gray suit, having come straight from the hospital finance department where I work as a senior healthcare financial auditor. We were 15 minutes early because that is how Grandma Ruby raised me, to respect other people's time and to always handle family business with quiet dignity. My mother Brenda, however, operated on a completely different schedule and an entirely different set of values. The heavy frosted glass door swung open, and she marched into the quiet reception area, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dark purple dress that looked more suited for a royal coronation than a legal meeting. She did not walk over to hug Aaliyah. She did not ask how I was holding up after spending the last 4 years managing Grandma's brutal medical decline. Instead, she immediately looked down at my sensible work shoes and sighed loudly, making sure the receptionist could hear her displeasure. "You could have dressed up a little bit, Jasmine," she said, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "We are here to discuss your grandmother's legacy and the future of this family, not a hospital cafeteria budget. Try to look like you belong here." I kept my face perfectly neutral, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately wanted. "I dress for the job that pays my bills, Mom," I replied evenly, keeping my voice low. Before Brenda could launch into her usual lecture about maintaining appearances for the sake of the church community, the glass door flew open again. My sister Chantel and her white husband Greg made their grand entrance, and they made absolutely sure that everyone in the quiet law office knew they had arrived. Chantel was carrying a bright red designer handbag that cost more than 2 months of my mortgage. She wore massive dark sunglasses indoors, and her high heels clicked sharply against the tile floor. Greg trailed closely behind her, wearing a custom navy blue suit and a heavy gold watch that he constantly adjusted so it would catch the overhead light. They looked like they were walking onto the set of a reality television show instead of preparing to read the last will and testament of a woman who had just passed away. "Oh my God, the traffic in this neighborhood is absolutely toxic," Chantel announced loudly, pulling off her sunglasses and tossing her long hair over her shoulder. "Greg had to park the Rover 2 blocks away because there is no valet service around here. I cannot believe Grandma used a lawyer in this part of town." She finally noticed me and Aaliyah sitting quietly in the corner of the room. "Oh, hey, Jasmine," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "I am so glad you could take a few hours off from crunching numbers in a cubicle to be here today." I simply nodded, my expression blank. "I am the executor of the estate, Chantel," I said calmly. "I have to be here." Chantel scoffed and rolled her eyes, making her way to the plush leather sofa to sit right next to Brenda. Brenda immediately reached over and patted Chantel's knee, looking at her eldest daughter as if she was the greatest achievement of her entire life. "Well, it will not take long," Brenda said confidently, smoothing down her purple skirt. "Your grandmother knew exactly who the business-minded people in this family are. She always wanted the best for us." Chantel nodded enthusiastically, pulling a sleek silver tablet out of her oversized designer bag. "Greg and I have already been drawing up the blueprints for the property," she said, tapping the digital screen with a manicured nail. "The brownstone is completely paid off. We are going to gut the entire first floor and turn that old dusty parlor into the headquarters for my new lifestyle and wellness brand. It is going to be an exclusive space for high-end content creation. I already have contractors lined up to knock down the load-bearing walls to open up the space for better lighting. Greg leaned against the edge of the reception desk, trying to posture himself like a titan of industry. The property value in that specific historic district has absolutely skyrocketed over the last 5 years, he said, smoothly adjusting his expensive cuffs. We are currently carrying some minor renovation loans from our downtown condo, so we will probably need to liquidate Grandma Ruby's vintage jewelry collection to cover the initial construction costs on the brownstone. But the return on investment will be massive once Chantel's brand officially launches. We are talking about building generational wealth here. I sat there in stunned silence, listening to them openly plot to tear apart the beautiful historic home my grandparents had spent 40 years building together. They were casually talking about selling off precious family heirlooms just to pay for their own personal debts and finance. Another one of Chantel's failed internet business ventures. Aaliyah squeezed my hand tightly, her brown eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you going to sell Grandma's wedding ring too?" Aaliyah asked, her voice quiet but sharp with protective anger. Chantel let out a loud, condescending laugh. "Oh, Aaliyah, sweetie, you do not understand how high-level wealth management works," Chantel said, waving her hand dismissively at my daughter. "You are just a teenager, and your mother spends her days auditing hospital bedpans. She means well, but she does not have the vision for real wealth." Brenda nodded in fierce agreement, her face glowing with pride as she looked at my sister. "Your sister has a master's degree in communications," Jasmine, Brenda said, turning to me with a deeply pitying look. "She understands corporate branding. She understands high society. You have always been so terribly stubborn, insisting on doing everything the hard way ever since you ruined your life by getting pregnant at 17. You need to step back today and let the educated adults handle the estate. Do not make this difficult, Jasmine." I let the insult wash over me without giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. They loved to throw my teenage pregnancy in my face at every opportunity. They used it as a weapon, acting as if raising a brilliant 18-year-old daughter who was heading off to a top-tier university on a full academic scholarship was somehow a massive failure. They loved to loudly praise Chantel's master's degree, while conveniently ignoring the fact that Brenda had secretly drained her own retirement savings just to pay for Chantel's tuition. They also loved to ignore the fact that Chantel had spent the last 6 years completely unemployed, living entirely off her husband's credit cards while pretending to be an influencer. I knew exactly who the most educated adult in the room was. I also knew that while they were busy picking out modern paint colors for a house they did not even own, I was the only person in this family who had actually sat by Grandma Ruby's hospital bed every single night. I was the one who made sure her nurses turned her properly so she would not get bed sores. I was the one holding her hand when she took her final breath. I did not need to argue with their delusions in the waiting room. I knew exactly what was waiting for them inside the sealed manila envelope sitting on the attorney's desk. "You are right, Mom," I said, leaning back against the wooden bench and offering them a very small, very tight smile. "I definitely think we should step back and let the legal documents speak for themselves today." Greg smirked, checking his heavy gold watch again, clearly annoyed that the attorney was keeping a man of his supposed importance waiting. "Time is money," he muttered loudly, tapping his foot. "Let us just get this paperwork signed so Chantel and I can get the demolition crew on the phone." Just then, the heavy, solid oak door to the inner office clicked open. Mr. Sterling, a tall older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped out into the waiting room, holding a thick, heavily sealed folder. He looked at the 5 of us, his sharp eyes lingering briefly on Chantel's flashy outfit and Greg's deeply arrogant posture, before finally settling on me. He offered me a soft, respectful nod, acknowledging the countless hours we had spent together, organizing Grandma's medical care over the past few years. "We are ready to begin," Mr. Sterling said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that commanded absolute attention. "Please step into my office." We followed Mr. Sterling into his spacious office. The walls were lined with heavy law books, and the air felt incredibly thick. My mother immediately took the best leather chair positioned directly in front of the massive oak desk. Chantel and Greg sat next to her, practically vibrating with greed. I guided Aaliyah to a small love seat in the corner, holding her hand firmly. She was trembling slightly, not from excitement, but from the overwhelming grief of losing her great-grandmother. Mr. Sterling sat down, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and broke the red wax seal on the thick manila envelope. He did not offer any warm pleasantries. He knew my family all too well, and he had zero patience for their theatrics. He cleared his throat and began reading the standard legal introductions. Chantel leaned forward, her designer handbag resting in her lap, her eyes wide with anticipation. She actually nudged Greg and whispered something about calling the demolition contractors this afternoon. Then Mr. Sterling reached the core of the document. Regarding my primary residence located in the historic district, he read aloud, his voice steady and deliberate. Regarding my liquid assets, including my life insurance policies and my complete collection of vintage jewelry. Brenda smiled a tight, triumphant smile. She reached out and patted Chantel's knee. They were both waiting to hear their names called out like winners at a lottery drawing. But Mr. Sterling did not say Chantel's name. He did not say Brenda's name. I hereby leave the entirety of these assets to my great-granddaughter Aaliyah. He continued reading from the heavy parchment. They are to be placed into an ironclad trust immediately upon my passing. Furthermore, I appoint my granddaughter Jasmine as the sole executor of this estate with complete and absolute authority over the distribution of funds for Aaliyah's education and well-being. For 3 agonizing seconds, the room was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Then, the reality of what Mr. Sterling had just read finally penetrated Chantel's brain, and the chaos absolutely erupted. "What did you just say?" Chantel shrieked, jumping out of her chair so fast her expensive bag hit the floor. The heavy metal hardware clattered against the hard wood, but she did not even notice. "You read that wrong. Look at it again. Grandma promised me that house. She knew I was building a brand. I am the oldest granddaughter. I read it exactly as it is written." "Chantel," Mr. Sterling replied coldly, placing the document flat on his desk. "Your grandmother was extremely clear about her intentions. She had me draft this updated will 6 months ago, and she underwent a full psychological evaluation that same day to prove she was of sound mind. This trust is ironclad. You and your mother were intentionally omitted from the inheritance." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. "This is a mistake," she cried out, her voice shaking with genuine panic. "My own mother would never leave me destitute. Jasmine manipulated her. Jasmine spent all that time alone with her at the memory care facility, poisoning her mind against us." I felt a surge of pure protective anger rise in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly still. I did not need to defend myself to a woman who had not visited her own dying mother in over 8 months. Greg stood up, buttoning his custom suit jacket, his face flushed bright red with fury. "This is completely unacceptable," he barked, leaning over the attorney's desk. "You cannot bypass the direct next of kin to hand a multi-million-dollar estate to a teenager. I am a wealth manager. I know exactly how trust law works. We will tie this up in probate court so fast your head will spin. We will demand an immediate competency hearing for the deceased." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. "You can file whatever motions you like, Mr. Gregg," he said, calmly adjusting his glasses. "But I assure you the medical documentation is bulletproof." Ruby knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to protect her legacy from being squandered. That word pushed Chantel over the edge. "Squandered," she screamed, turning her absolute rage toward my daughter. "You are giving it to the teenage pregnancy. I have a master's degree. I deserve that house. I am the one who is actually trying to elevate this family name." I stood up slowly, stepping directly in front of Aaliyah to shield her from Chantel's venomous glare. I looked my sister up and down, taking in her thousands of dollars worth of clothing that I knew she bought on credit. A master's degree does not mean much when you have been mysteriously between jobs for the last 6 years. "Chantel," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "An 18-year-old heading off to college on a full academic scholarship is a much better investment than a 38-year-old who lives off her husband's credit cards and pretends to be rich on the internet." Chantel's mouth fell open. Her face contorted with a vicious anger, and she took a step toward me, looking like she wanted to physically attack me right there in the law office. But Greg grabbed her arm, pulling her back harshly. "Do not engage with her," Greg hissed, glaring at me with pure hatred. "She thinks she has won because she tricked an old lady into signing a piece of paper, but she has absolutely no idea what she just started." Brenda was sobbing loudly now, performing loud wails of betrayal, demanding that Mr. Sterling fix the paperwork immediately. But the attorney simply folded his hands, placed them on top of the manila folder, and stated clearly that the reading was officially concluded. My family had walked into that room expecting a coronation, but they were walking out completely empty-handed. And judging by the look of pure desperation in Greg's eyes, I knew this was only the beginning of the war. The heavy oak door of the law office clicked shut behind us, sealing my family out in the dimly lit hallway. The transition from the cool, quiet sanctuary of Mr. Sterling's office to the stifling heat of the corridor felt like stepping directly into a furnace. My mother, Brenda, immediately leaned against the peeling wallpaper and let out a long, dramatic wail, covering her face with her hands. She was already practicing the victim narrative she would undoubtedly spin for her church friends on Sunday. Chantel did not bother comforting her. My sister was furiously tapping away on her silver tablet, her face twisted into an ugly snarl as she aggressively canceled the demolition contractors she had so arrogantly booked just hours before. The sharp, angry clicks of her manicured fingernails hitting the glass screen echoed down the narrow hall. She marched toward the elevator without looking back, shouting over her shoulder that her entire week was ruined and someone was going to pay for this humiliation. Brenda hurried after her, still sobbing loudly, leaving my daughter and me standing alone near the stairwell. Or so I thought. As I placed my hand gently on Aaliyah's back to guide her toward the exit, a large shadow fell over us. Greg had intentionally hung back, letting his wife and mother-in-law leave first. He stepped directly into our path, physically blocking us from reaching the elevator bank. The polished, friendly brother-in-law persona he had meticulously maintained for the last 5 years was completely gone. The man standing in front of me now was cold, calculating and practically vibrating with an aggressive, arrogant energy. He reached up and slowly unbuttoned his custom navy blue suit jacket, planting his feet wide to maximize his physical presence in the cramped hallway. "Aaliyah, you can go wait with your grandmother by the elevator," Greg said, his voice completely devoid of its usual fake warmth. "Your mother and I need to have a conversation about how things are actually going to work moving forward." Aaliyah instinctively stepped closer to me, her shoulder pressing against my arm. "I am not going anywhere," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear I knew she was feeling. "I am staying right here with my mom." I squeezed her hand proudly, but I knew exactly how dangerous men like Greg could be when they felt their authority was being challenged. "It is okay, baby," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked dead on Greg. "Go stand by the elevator doors. Do not get in until I am right there with you. I will only be a minute." Aaliyah hesitated but nodded slowly, slipping past Greg and walking down the hall out of earshot. Once she was gone, the last shred of Greg's polite facade melted away entirely. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, forcing me to look up at him. The overpowering smell of his expensive cologne mixed with a sharp underlying scent of nervous sweat. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Jasmine?" he sneered, his voice dropping into a low, venomous register. "You think because you changed some bedpans and held an old woman's hand that you somehow outplayed us. You think you secured a payday." "I am not playing a game, Greg," I replied, my voice perfectly level, refusing to give him an inch of ground. "I am executing the legally binding wishes of my grandmother, and I am protecting my daughter's future from a family that only views her as a disposable inconvenience." Greg let out a harsh, grating laugh that sounded more like a bark. He shook his head, looking down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Let me explain something to you about the real world, Jasmine. You audit hospital cafeterias for a living. You punch a clock and look at spreadsheets for middle management. I am a junior partner at Vanguard Wealth Management. I move millions of dollars before you even finish your morning coffee. I have lunch with state judges and city council members. People like me do not lose to people like you." I stood my ground, refusing to let his corporate bullying intimidate me. The law is very clear, I stated firmly. The trust is ironclad. You heard Mr. Sterling. The medical documentation proves Grandma Ruby was of sound mind when she established Aaliyah as the sole beneficiary. Greg leaned in so close I could see the tiny broken blood vessels in the whites of his eyes. Ironclad is a word poor people use when they do not understand how expensive the legal system actually is, he hissed. I do not need to break the trust, Jasmine. I just need to bleed it dry. He lifted his heavy leather briefcase slightly as if to emphasize the weight of his resources. If you do not convince your kid to sign a relinquishment form, handing control of those assets over to Chantel and me, I will personally file an injunction tomorrow morning. I will contest the will. I will claim you used your background in healthcare to isolate and manipulate an elderly dementia patient. I will demand a full investigation into every single decision you made regarding her care. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I kept my face blank. You have absolutely no proof of that, because it never happened, I said, my tone unwavering. Proof does not matter. Greg spat back, a cruel smile stretching across his face. The process is the punishment. The second I file that motion, the court will freeze the entire estate. Aaliyah will not get a single dime for her college tuition. She will not get the brownstone. She will get nothing. I will drag this out in probate court for the next 10 years. By the time my firm is done billing the estate for the litigation, there will be nothing left but dust and legal fees. You will bankrupt your own daughter trying to fight me. I looked at him closely, really looked at him. As a financial auditor, I am trained to look past the numbers and observe the human behavior attached to the money. I noticed the way his knuckles were white as he gripped his briefcase. I noticed the slight tremor in his jaw. I noticed that for a man who claimed to have endless resources and power, he was acting incredibly desperate over a $3 million estate that belonged to his wife's grandmother. Men with real wealth do not threaten to destroy teenagers in a hallway over real estate. Men who are drowning do. Vanguard Wealth Management is a highly respected firm, I said slowly, watching his reaction to every word. I find it very hard to believe that your senior partners would approve of you using their legal team to wage a petty retaliatory war against an 18-year-old girl over a family inheritance. Unless, of course, you need this money for something else, something you are hiding from Chantel. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped. Greg's eyes widened slightly, and a flash of genuine panic crossed his face before he quickly smothered it with rage. He took another step forward, trying to use his height to physically back me against the wall, but I planted my feet and refused to move. You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with, Jasmine, he whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying intensity. You are entirely out of your depth. I am giving you one chance to walk away clean. Go home, talk to your kid, and tell her to sign the papers. I looked him dead in the eye, completely unfazed by his posturing. Aaliyah is going to college on a full academic scholarship, Greg. We do not need the estate money right now. We can wait 10 years. Can you? The question hit him like a physical blow. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He realized in that exact moment that I was not the weak, submissive scapegoat my mother had raised me to be. I was a mother protecting her child, and I was willing to burn his entire world to the ground to do it. Greg stepped back abruptly, pulling his expensive phone from his inside pocket. He did not bother putting his friendly mask back on. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. Consider this your final warning, he said, his thumb hovering over the screen. You will regret crossing me by tomorrow morning, Jasmine. That is not a threat. That is a guarantee. He turned on his heel and walked briskly down the hallway toward the elevators without looking back. I stood alone in the quiet corridor, the oppressive heat pressing against my skin. My heart was racing, but my mind was completely clear. Greg thought he was the smartest predator in the jungle. He thought he could use his money and his corporate title to crush us. But he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated me. It took exactly 3 days for my mother to change her tactics. When brute force and legal threats failed in the hallway of the law office, they decided to pivot to emotional warfare. The phone call came on a Thursday evening right as I was finishing up a financial audit report for the hospital. My mother Brenda did not call to apologize for the scene at the attorney's office. She did not call to check on how Aaliyah was handling her grief. Her voice was dripping with a sickly, sweet tone that instantly made my stomach clench. She said Pastor Davis had preached a powerful sermon about forgiveness and family unity. She insisted that we come over for a traditional Sunday dinner to heal the divide. I knew immediately it was a trap. In our family, Sunday dinner was never just a meal. It was an institution. It was a carefully controlled stage where my mother directed the narrative, doled out favor to Chantel, and handed down punishment to me over plates of smothered pork chops and candied yams. I wanted to say no. I wanted to block her number. But Aaliyah has always had a soft, forgiving heart. She looked at me with those hopeful brown eyes and said, "Maybe Grandma really does want to fix things." I could not crush my daughter's hope, but I absolutely refused to let her walk into that house unprotected. When we arrived at my mother's house that Sunday afternoon, the heavy scent of soul food hit me the moment we stepped onto the porch. Under any other circumstances, the smell of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and slow-cooked collard greens with smoked turkey would be deeply comforting. But today, it smelled like bait. I pushed the front door open and walked into the living room. Chantel and Greg were already there, treating my mother's house like it was their own personal country club lounge. Chantel was sprawled on the floral sofa, scrolling through her phone, while Greg stood by the fireplace sipping a glass of expensive bourbon he had clearly brought from his own private collection. Neither of them bothered to say hello. Greg just offered me a tight, knowing smirk that told me everything I needed to know. The ambush was set. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She completely ignored me and walked straight to Aaliyah, pulling my daughter into a suffocating hug. "Oh, my sweet girl," Brenda cooed loudly. "I am so glad you came. Family needs to stick together in these dark testing times." We moved into the dining room and Brenda immediately began orchestrating the seating arrangement to isolate her target. She instructed Aaliyah to sit right next to her at the head of the table, effectively placing a physical barrier between my daughter and me. I did not argue, but I pulled my chair up directly across from them, maintaining unbroken eye contact with anyone who dared to look my way. Before we could touch a single piece of food, Brenda insisted on saying grace. But this was not a prayer of gratitude. It was a weaponized sermon delivered with her eyes squeezed shut and her hands raised. "Lord, we ask you to soften the hardened hearts of those at this table." She prayed, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. "We ask you to cast out the spirits of greed and selfishness. Remind those who hoard blessings that the scripture tells us to honor our elders and share our daily bread. Bring conviction to those who have lost their way so they might do the Christian thing and restore this family." I kept my eyes wide open, staring directly at Greg, who was trying very hard to look pious while sneaking a sip of his bourbon. "Amen," Brenda finally whispered, wiping a completely dry eye. The first 15 minutes of the meal were filled with the clinking of silverware and thick, suffocating tension. Chantel complained about the lack of good lighting in her condo, while Brenda heaped praise on Greg for his demanding job. But the moment Aaliyah took her last bite of macaroni and cheese, Brenda pushed her own plate away. The performance was about to begin. Brenda reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled tissue, and let out a loud, ragged sob. The sound echoed through the dining room, freezing everyone in place. "I am so sorry," Brenda cried, dabbing at her face. "I did not want to burden you girls today. I wanted this to be a happy meal. But my heart is just breaking under the weight of this cross I am bearing." Aaliyah immediately put her fork down, her large eyes full of concern. "What is wrong, Grandma?" she asked softly, leaning closer. Brenda took a deep, shaky breath, looking at Aaliyah with an expression of pure manufactured devastation. "I got a notice from the bank on Friday, baby. I am going to lose this house. The bank is threatening foreclosure and I do not have the money to stop them." Aaliyah gasped. The thought of her grandmother being thrown out on the street was tearing at her gentle heart. "But Grandma, you have lived here for 30 years, Aaliyah said, her voice tight with worry. "I know," Brenda wailed, gripping the edge of the table. But your great-grandmother was so sick at the end. Her mind was completely gone. She forgot to include her own daughter in the will, and now I'm going to be homeless. I will have to pack up my life and live in a shelter, all because Ruby lost her senses in her final days. It was a masterful lie. Grandma Ruby had not forgotten Brenda. Grandma Ruby knew exactly what she was doing, but Brenda was playing on Aaliyah's innocent lack of knowledge. Brenda reached out and grabbed Aaliyah's hands, squeezing them tightly. "You have the power to fix this terrible mistake, Aaliyah." Brenda cooed, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading register. "You have always been such a sweet girl. You have the Spirit of the Lord in you. You know that God calls us to honor our mothers and grandmothers. You know He wants us to be generous." Aaliyah looked down at her hands, trapped in her grandmother's grip. "How can I help?" Aaliyah whispered, her voice wavering. "Sign the brownstone over to your Aunt Chantel and Uncle Greg." Brenda said the words tumbling out of her mouth with rehearsed precision. "Just sign the relinquishment form. They have the resources to manage a property like that. They promised me that if they get the estate, they will let me live in the brownstone with them. They will take care of me. We can fix your great-grandmother's tragic mistake right now. You can save my life." Chantel leaned forward across the table, putting on a face of deep, solemn sacrifice. "It is a massive financial burden," Aaliyah Chantel chimed in, her tone dripping with fake sincerity. "But Greg and I are willing to take it on because we love this family. We are willing to step up and do the heavy lifting so Grandma does not end up on the street. Do not be greedy like your mother, Aaliyah. Do the Christian thing." Greg nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You need to focus on your college midterms. Aaliyah, not property taxes and estate maintenance," he added, his voice slick and reasonable. "Let the educated adults handle the business. It is a win for everyone. You get to be a normal teenager, and your grandmother gets to keep a roof over her head." They were surrounding her, closing in on her from every side. They were weaponizing her faith, her empathy, and her love for her family to steal $3 million from her. I watched Aaliyah's shoulders slump under the crushing weight of the guilt they were piling onto her. She looked at her plate, and then she looked at me, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. She was breaking. She was actually considering giving away her entire future just to save a woman who was lying straight to her face. "I do not want you to be homeless," Grandma Aaliyah whispered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Brenda smiled a victorious, predatory smile and pulled a pen from her apron pocket. "I knew you would do the right thing, baby," she said. I placed my hands flat on the dining room table. The time for observing was officially over. I pushed my chair back so hard the wooden legs shrieked against the dining room floor. The sudden noise shattered the suffocating atmosphere like a hammer through glass. Before Brenda could even uncap that pen, I reached across the table and snatched it right out of her hand. I tossed the pen over my shoulder and watched it bounce off the hardwood floor into the hallway. "Aaliyah is not signing a single thing today," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a dangerous calm. "Or any day." Brenda gasped, pulling her hands back to her chest as if I had burned her. "Jasmine, how dare you?" she cried, her voice thick with manufactured outrage. "I am your mother. I am the matriarch of this family." "And I am her mother," I fired back, pointing a finger down at the table. "And my daughter will not be the sacrificial lamb for your financial incompetence." Chantel slammed her phone face down on the table, her eyes flashing with anger. "She is trying to save this family," Jasmine Chantel snapped. "She is trying to keep a roof over her head, and you are just sitting there being a bitter, ungrateful brat like you always are. Aaliyah wants to help. You are the only one standing in the way of family unity." "Save the family from what, Chantel?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the white tablecloth. "From the consequences of your own greed. Let us tell Aaliyah the real reason this house is going into foreclosure. Since we are being such good Christians today, let us bring the truth out into the light." I turned to my daughter, who was sitting frozen in her chair, looking back and forth between me and her grandmother. The tears were still wet on her cheeks, but the confusion in her eyes was slowly sharpening into focus. "Grandma Ruby did not leave your grandmother destitute." "Aaliyah," I said, speaking clearly and deliberately, so every single word landed exactly where it was supposed to. She left her out of the will intentionally because she found out what your grandmother did behind her back in 2018. Brenda's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She knew exactly what I was about to say, and the sheer terror of being exposed in front of her golden son-in-law made her hands tremble. "Do you remember Aunt Chantel's wedding, Aaliyah?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked on my daughter. Aaliyah nodded slowly. "The one in Cabo," she whispered. "Exactly," I said. "The lavish destination wedding with the imported white orchids, the private sunset catamaran cruise, and the customized ice sculptures. The wedding Chantel insisted she absolutely had to have because she told everyone she was marrying a high-powered wealth manager. The wedding she demanded even though she had been unemployed for 2 years and had absolutely no savings of her own. Do you know how they paid for that, Aaliyah? Because Greg certainly did not pay for it." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his grip tightening around his crystal bourbon glass. I looked right at Brenda, whose eyes were darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape. "Your grandmother secretly took out a second mortgage on this exact house," I revealed, letting the truth echo off the dining room walls. "She drained the equity that she and my father built over 30 hard years, just so Chantel could take pretty pictures on a beach and pretend to be wealthy for her internet followers. She risked her own home to fund a massive vanity project." "Stop talking," Brenda hissed, her sweet grandmotherly persona cracking entirely. "You do not know what you are talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I am talking about, Mom," I shot back. "I saw the bank statements when I took over Grandma's care. And more importantly, Grandma Ruby saw them." I turned back to Aaliyah, ensuring she understood the full weight of the deception. "Grandma Ruby worked her entire life cleaning houses and saving pennies before she bought her first commercial property. She valued hard work, and she despised fake luxury. When she discovered that her own daughter had jeopardized her home to pay for ice sculptures and champagne, she was absolutely disgusted. She swore she would never let Chantel or Brenda get their hands on her estate. She knew if she left them the brownstone, they would just liquidate it to pay off Chantel's mounting credit card debt. She did not forget Brenda because of her dementia, Aaliyah. She cut Brenda off because Brenda proved she could not be trusted with a single dime." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The smell of the soul food on the table suddenly felt sickening. Aaliyah looked at Brenda. The guilt that had been weighing down her young shoulders completely evaporated, replaced by a sharp, stinging sense of betrayal. "Aaliyah is smart. She has my analytical mind, and in that moment she put the pieces together perfectly." "You lied to me," Aaliyah whispered, her voice shaking with hurt. "You sat there and cried and told me Grandma Ruby forgot about you. You used her sickness as an excuse to trick me into giving up my college money." "I did not trick you," Brenda shrieked, slamming her hands flat against the table. Her face turned an ugly mottled shade of red, and the sweet church-going matriarch completely vanished, revealing the bitter, manipulative woman underneath. "I did what a mother is supposed to do. I gave my eldest daughter the wedding she deserved. I elevated this family name. Something you would know nothing about, Jasmine, since you ruined your life and brought shame into this house by having a child out of wedlock at 17. I did not flinch at the tired, recycled insult. They had used my teenage pregnancy against me for 18 years, and it had lost all its power. Having a child out of wedlock taught me how to budget and how to survive." I replied, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "It taught me how to protect my kid from predators. You gave your eldest daughter a party you could not afford, and now you are begging an 18-year-old girl to pay your past due bills. You are pathetic." Chantel's face flushed a deep, furious purple. The veins in her neck strained against her skin as she realized her flawless reputation had just been completely dismantled in front of everyone. I had exposed the fact that her entire luxury lifestyle was built on her mother's stolen equity, and she could not handle the humiliation. "Shut up, Jasmine!" Chantel screamed, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me because I actually found a husband And you are nothing but a single mother auditing hospital bedpans. Before I could even process her movement, Chantel grabbed her full glass of red wine and hurled the contents directly across the table. The dark liquid splashed across the front of my white blouse and stained the pristine tablecloth. Drops of red wine hit my cheek and dripped down onto my collarbone. Aaliyah jumped out of her chair in shock, letting out a gasp of horror. I did not scream. I did not raise my hand to strike her. I simply stood there, breathing slowly, letting the cold wine soak into my shirt. I slowly reached for my cloth napkin, picked it up, and deliberately wiped the wine from my cheek, keeping my eyes locked dead on my sister. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, expecting me to attack her. She wanted a physical fight because she had completely lost the intellectual one. But I was not going to give her the satisfaction. I had drawn the boundary in permanent ink and exposed their rotting foundation to the light. The emotional manipulation was over. They could no longer use guilt to control my daughter. I dropped the wine-stained cloth napkin onto the table, letting it absorb the dark red puddle. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating, broken only by Chantel's ragged, heavy breathing. She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to scream or lunge at her. She desperately wanted a physical fight because she knew she had completely lost the intellectual one. But I was not going to give her the satisfaction of reacting. I had drawn the boundary in permanent ink and exposed the rotting foundation of their fake luxury lifestyle to the light. The emotional manipulation was over. They could no longer use guilt to control my daughter. Aaliyah was trembling beside me, her wide brown eyes filled with fear and betrayal as she looked at the people who were supposed to be her family. That was when Greg decided it was time to step in and take total control of the narrative. He stood up slowly from his chair, picking up his crystal glass of bourbon and taking a final deliberate sip. He carefully buttoned his expensive navy blue suit jacket, projecting the image of a calm, rational professional who was being forced to deal with an unruly, hysterical child. He looked around the ruined dining room, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Look at what you are doing, Jasmine," Greg said, his voice dropping into a low, patronizing register. "You come into your mother's home for a peaceful Sunday dinner and immediately start terrorizing her. You provoke your sister into a complete emotional breakdown. You are creating a deeply toxic, volatile, and abusive environment for your teenage daughter." I scoffed, refusing to break eye contact with him. "You cannot be serious, Greg," I said, my voice flat. "Chantel just threw a glass of wine at me because I told the truth about how her wedding was funded, and you are calling me volatile." Greg shook his head, clicking his tongue. "This erratic, combative behavior is exactly what I was talking about. It is exactly why I had to take immediate protective action. I warned you in the hallway at the lawyer's office, Jasmine. I told you that you were entirely out of your depth, but you refused to listen." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thickly folded legal document. He tossed it onto the dining room table, letting it land right next to my spilled wine. "Because of your documented history of emotional instability and your clear abusive behavior today, my firm has officially filed a petition for an emergency conservatorship over Grandma Ruby's entire estate," Greg announced smoothly, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. I felt a sudden cold knot form in my stomach, but I kept my facial expression entirely blank. "A conservatorship," I repeated. "On what legal grounds, Greg?" "On the grounds of elder abuse and severe financial manipulation," Greg replied, folding his arms across his chest like a proud corporate titan. "We are claiming that you used your professional background in healthcare finance to deliberately isolate a vulnerable elderly woman. We are telling the probate court that you restricted our access to her and manipulated a patient suffering from advanced dementia into making you the sole executor of her estate." Brenda immediately recognized the legal strategy and grabbed onto it like a life preserver. "Yes," she cried out, pointing a trembling manicured finger at me. "She kept us away from my own mother. She controlled who could visit the memory care facility. She brainwashed poor Ruby against us. It was elder abuse." I stared at my mother, completely disgusted by her willingness to lie just to secure a payday. "You never visited, "Because you did not care, Mom," I shot back. "You never visited because you were too busy taking Chantel shopping for designer clothes on credit to maintain your fake image at the church. A judge is going to require actual medical proof of manipulation, Greg. Grandma passed a full psychological evaluation the day she signed that trust. You have absolutely nothing to stand on." Greg's arrogant smirk widened, revealing his perfectly white teeth. "Maybe," he said, leaning forward and resting his hands flat on the table. "But you clearly do not understand how an emergency petition works in the real world, Jasmine. I do not need to prove anything today. I just need to file the initial paperwork and claim there is an immediate threat of asset flight. While we wait for the judge to review the case, which could take months, the court automatically freezes the assets of anyone involved in the suspected financial abuse." The realization hit me instantly. He was not just trying to freeze the $3 million estate, he was trying to financially paralyze me. Right on cue, a sharp vibration buzzed against my hip. I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was lit up with an automated high-priority text message from my primary banking institution. I swiped the screen open and read the alert. "Urgent notice. Your personal checking account, your high-yield savings account, and your emergency credit lines have been temporarily frozen pending an active fraud investigation. Please contact the fraud department immediately to resolve this restriction." I looked up from the glowing screen, staring directly into Greg's cold, calculating eyes. He had used his professional leverage as a junior partner at Vanguard Wealth Management to flag my personal accounts. He had called in a massive favor at his firm to initiate a shadow fraud investigation, effectively cutting off my access to my own hard-earned money. He had weaponized the banking system against me. "Check your banking app, Jasmine," Greg whispered, his voice filled with venomous triumph. "You have absolutely no resources left. You cannot even buy groceries for your daughter right now, let alone hire a high-powered defense attorney to fight my corporate legal team. I have completely starved you out." He walked around the edge of the table, stopping right behind Aaliyah's chair, casting a long shadow over her. "Have Aaliyah sign the relinquishment form by Friday afternoon," Greg demanded, spelling out his twisted ultimatum. "Surrender the estate over to Chantel and me, and I will miraculously make the fraud investigation disappear. You get your checking account back, Aaliyah gets to go to college, and we forget this ever happened. But if you refuse, I promise you I will bury both of you so deep in legal debt you will never recover." Brenda sat quietly in her chair, watching her son-in-law financially execute her own daughter, and she did not say a single word to stop him. Chantel stood by the wall, wiping her face, looking incredibly smug, now that she felt the power dynamic had shifted back in her favor. They looked at me like I was a cornered animal. They truly thought they had backed me into an inescapable trap. They thought stripping away my money would force me to break down, cry, and surrender to their demands. I slipped my phone back into my purse. I did not cry. I did not beg for mercy. I simply reached out, took Aaliyah's hand, pulled her away from the dining table, and walked out of that toxic house without looking back. They thought freezing my bank accounts would destroy me. They completely forgot that I am a senior healthcare financial auditor. I spend my days tracking missing millions through labyrinthine hospital networks and exposing corrupt corporate executives. I do not need a checking account to completely destroy them. I only need a paper trail. The drive back to our apartment was completely silent. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The emotional whiplash of the afternoon had exhausted her. She had walked into her grandmother's house expecting a healing Sunday dinner, and instead she had been ambushed, lied to, and nearly bullied into signing away her entire future. I kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, my mind already moving 10 steps ahead. Greg thought he had delivered a fatal blow by freezing my bank accounts. He thought he had cut off my oxygen, but he did not understand that starving a predator only makes it hunt with absolute ruthless precision. When we walked through our front door, Aaliyah finally broke the silence. She dropped her purse on the counter and looked at me. Her brown eyes filled with a quiet, terrifying uncertainty. "Mom, how are we going to pay for groceries?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How are we going to pay the rent if Uncle Greg locked all your money?" I walked over and pulled my daughter into a tight, fierce embrace. Do not give that arrogant man a single second of your worry. Aaliyah, I said, smoothing her hair. I have emergency cash in the safe that he cannot touch. I have friends who will spot us whatever we need. Greg is trying to use panic to force us into submission, but we are not going to panic. We are going to go to war. Go get some sleep, baby. I have a lot of work to do. After I tucked Aaliyah into bed, I walked into my home office and shut the door. I booted up my dual monitors and poured myself a massive cup of black coffee. The clock on the wall read 9 in the evening. I had 72 hours before the probate courts opened on Monday morning to review Greg's emergency conservatorship petition. Because Greg had only filed the paperwork, my legal status as the executor of Grandma Ruby's estate was still technically active. He had used his shady corporate connections to trigger a fraud alert on my personal checking accounts, but he did not have a judge's signature to lock me out of the estate portals yet. He had left a tiny window cracked open, and I was about to climb right through it and tear his entire life apart. While I was logging into the secure portals, I made the mistake of checking my phone. Chantel had already taken to social media to celebrate what she believed was her ultimate victory. She had posted a series of smug, vague stories on her profile. The first was a picture of her holding a glass of expensive champagne, with a caption about claiming her blessings and elevating her mindset. The second was a text post talking about how sometimes you have to cut off toxic, bitter family members to protect your peace and your wealth. She was practically taking a victory lap on the internet, entirely convinced that by Friday, she would be the proud owner of a $3 million historic brownstone. I tossed my phone face down on the desk, let her drink her champagne, let her post her fake inspirational quotes. I was about to give her a masterclass in what real wealth protection looked like. For the next 3 consecutive nights, I did not sleep. I lived on black coffee and adrenaline. I turned my home office into a forensic accounting war room. I legally requested and pulled the last 5 years of Grandma Ruby's medical care logs, nursing invoices, pharmacy receipts, and detailed bank statements. I printed out hundreds of pages of financial records and pinned them to the walls, connecting dates and dollar amounts with a red marker. As a senior healthcare financial auditor, I spend 40 hours a week tracking missing millions through labyrinthine hospital networks. I expose corrupt corporate executives who try to hide stolen money in complex shell companies. Tearing apart the sloppy financial footprint of a junior wealth manager and 2 greedy women was not just easy for me. It was therapeutic. I started by auditing the memory care facility payments. For the last 4 years of her life, Grandma Ruby required round-the-clock specialized nursing care. It was an incredibly expensive necessity. During that time, my mother Brenda had paraded around the church congregation accepting sympathy and praise. She had boldly told the pastor and all her friends that she and Chantel were making massive financial sacrifices, splitting the exorbitant cost of the private nurses to ensure Grandma was comfortable. Brenda used that lie to build her reputation as a devoted, selfless daughter. But the bank statements spread across my desk told the exact opposite story. I tracked every single invoice from the memory care facility. I traced the routing numbers and the account origins for every single payment over a 4-year period. The facility cost exactly $6,000 a month. And the records proved undeniably that Brenda and Chantel had never contributed a single dime. They had not paid for a single bandage, a single meal, or a single hour of nursing care. Every single payment of $6,000 a month for 48 months had been wired directly from my personal savings account. I had paid $288,000 out of my own pocket to keep my grandmother safe, while my sister bought designer handbags, and my mother funded a fake luxury lifestyle. I highlighted the final totals with a bright yellow marker and smiled grimly. This was my first weapon. By legally documenting that I was the sole financial provider for the deceased, I automatically became a primary creditor to the estate. This meant that even if Greg somehow managed to win the conservatorship and force Aaliyah to step away, he would still legally have to pay me back nearly $300,000 from the estate before Chantel or Brenda could see a single penny. I had effectively placed a massive financial lien against the very property they were trying to steal. But I was not satisfied with just protecting my money. I wanted to know why Greg was so aggressively desperate. I knew that a man in his position, a junior partner at Vanguard Wealth Management, did not risk his entire career and his legal license just to help his wife secure a family house. There was something else driving him. A man only acts with that kind of reckless, arrogant desperation when he is standing on the edge of a cliff and trying to hide the drop. I shifted my focus away from the medical bills and dove directly into Grandma Ruby's personal checking and investment accounts. I started cross-referencing the dates of her declining health with the bank withdrawals, running a shadow trace on every transaction over $500. It took me 12 hours of relentless digging, but right around 4 in the morning on the third night, I found the smoking gun. It was buried deep in the statements from 2 years ago. During a specific 8-month period, there was a massive glaring anomaly. I found 12 different canceled checks written out from Grandma Ruby's primary account to a subsidiary investment firm. The checks were completely out of character for a woman who only ever spent money on groceries, church donations, and modest gifts for Aaliyah. I tallied the amounts. The 12 checks totaled exactly $140,000. I pulled the digital copies of the canceled checks and stared at the signatures on the bottom line. The blood in my veins turned to ice. The signatures read, Ruby Jefferson, but they were entirely too perfect. They matched the clear, elegant, cursive Grandma used 10 years ago. I immediately pulled the corresponding medical care logs from the exact dates those checks were dated. I read the nurse's daily notes. On the date the first check for $20,000 was supposedly signed, Grandma Ruby was suffering from a severe arthritis flare-up and advanced cognitive disorientation. The nursing notes explicitly stated that the patient was unable to hold a spoon to feed herself and required full assistance with basic motor functions. There was absolutely no physical way she could have gripped a pen, let alone signed a legally binding financial document with perfect, flawless penmanship. Someone had forged her signature. Someone had stolen her checkbook, practiced her handwriting, and systematically drained $140,000 of her life savings while she lay bedridden and defenseless in a memory care facility. I tracked the routing numbers on the back of the canceled checks. I needed to know exactly where that stolen money went. I bypassed the standard banking firewalls using my audit software to trace the subsidiary investment firm that received the funds. The corporate registration documents loaded onto my screen, and I almost laughed out loud at the sheer unadulterated hubris of it all. The subsidiary firm was not a standard mutual fund or a safe retirement portfolio. It was a high-risk, aggressive cryptocurrency trading block managed directly by Vanguard Wealth Management. And the specific portfolio manager listed on the corporate filing was Greg. My brother-in-law had forged an elderly dying woman's signature to siphon $140,000 into his own high-risk investment accounts. He had committed textbook felony wire fraud and elder abuse. He had done exactly what he was currently accusing me of doing. I leaned back in my office chair, the harsh blue light of the monitors illuminating the dark room. My heart was hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I pulled up the public market records for the specific crypto assets Greg had purchased with Grandma's stolen money. I followed the market trend lines from 2 years ago to the present day. The graph looked like a cliff face. The portfolio had completely tanked within 6 months of the purchase. The $140,000 was gone. It had completely vaporized in a spectacular market crash, leaving absolutely nothing behind. But the puzzle was still missing its final piece. Greg was a junior partner. He made a massive salary. Losing $140,000 of his mother-in-law's money was a crime, but it was not enough to explain why he was willing to destroy my 18-year-old daughter today. It was not enough to explain the blind panic I had seen in his eyes in the hallway of the law office. There had to be a bigger hole. I knew that financial predators who steal from their own family usually do it because they have already exhausted every other avenue. If he was desperate enough to steal from a bedridden woman, he was desperate enough to steal from his own clients. I cracked my knuckles, took a sip of cold coffee, and launched a deep background dive into the public disciplinary filings and internal audit reports of Vanguard Wealth Management. It was well past dawn now, The sun was rising, casting a pale yellow light through my office blinds. But I did not stop. I was a surgeon operating on the cancerous tumor that was my family, and I was not going to stop cutting until I had exposed the entire disease. The sun was fully up by the time my audit software finally broke through the last layers of corporate obfuscation. Vanguard Wealth Management is designed to be a fortress of financial security, but every single fortress has a weak point if you know exactly where to apply pressure. I bypassed the standard external firewalls and dug deep into the public arbitration notices and internal compliance logs that were buried under mountains of dense legal jargon. I was looking for a specific pattern. I was looking for the real reason a highly paid junior partner was willing to commit blatant elder abuse over a family inheritance. It took another 2 hours of cross-referencing account identification numbers before I finally found the massive bleeding wound Greg had been desperately trying to hide. He had set up 3 different dummy corporations using offshore registration codes. To anyone else outside the financial sector, these would look like standard holding companies used by wealthy clients for tax optimization. But I am a senior healthcare financial auditor. I look at fraudulent corporate structures and money laundering attempts all day long. I recognized the chaotic, desperate shuffling of money immediately. I pulled up a confidential internal review that had been flagged by the Vanguard Compliance Department just 3 weeks ago. The document detailed a massive discrepancy in a specific block of high net worth client portfolios. I ran the management identification numbers through my shadow trace, and every single one of them pointed directly back to Greg. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping together with terrifying precision. 2 years ago, Greg did not just take $140,000 from Grandma Ruby because he was feeling greedy. That forgery was actually a desperate panic move. He stole Grandma's money to try and cover a much larger hole he had already dug. According to the internal audit, Greg had been secretly siphoning money from his wealthiest clients for the past 3 years. He had taken their safe, secure retirement funds and illegally diverted them into his own highly leveraged cryptocurrency accounts. He was playing an incredibly dangerous, arrogant game. He was hoping to strike it rich, pocket the massive returns for himself, and quietly put the original funds back into the client accounts before anyone noticed the money was temporarily missing. But the crypto market did not soar, it completely crashed. Greg lost the client funds. He panicked and forged Grandma Ruby's checks to buy back into the market, hoping a quick, aggressive rebound would allow him to replace the stolen money. But that investment tanked too. Now he was completely out of options, and the financial hole he had dug was catastrophic. I highlighted the final deficit on the compliance report. Greg was exactly $800,000 in debt to his own clients. He had embezzled nearly $1 million and lost every single penny of it. I read the final paragraph of the internal review, and a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. The firm had quietly suspended Greg's trading privileges. They had placed him under strict internal review and given him a brutal ultimatum. He had exactly until the end of this current month to replace the missing $800,000. If the funds were not restored to the client accounts by the deadline, Vanguard was legally obligated to turn the entire investigation over to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal authorities. Greg was not facing a slap on the wrist or a simple termination. He was facing multiple counts of felony wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. He was facing 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I sat back in my office chair staring at the glowing monitors as the absolute magnitude of his desperation washed over me. This was never about Chantel's fake internet lifestyle brand. This was never about paying off some minor renovation loans or securing generational wealth for our family. I realized with stunning clarity how deeply Greg had manipulated my sister and my mother. He had convinced Chantel that they needed the historic brownstone to expand her brand. He had convinced her to hire demolition contractors to gut the house. But he never actually intended to renovate the property. He needed a legitimate excuse to quickly list the property on the market and liquidate the asset. He needed to sell the house for cash right now to pay back the $800,000 he stole from his clients before the end of the month deadline. Chantel and my mother were just useful idiots blinded by their own greed, entirely unaware of the massive criminal enterprise they were helping to facilitate. They thought they were bullying an 18-year-old girl to get a free house. Greg was bullying an 18-year-old girl to stay out of a federal prison cell. If Aaliyah refused to sign the paperwork, Greg would be exposed. He would lose his job, his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. That was why he brought 3 corporate lawyers to ambush a teenager. That was why he filed an emergency conservatorship to freeze my bank accounts and starve me out. He was not fighting a petty family battle over real estate. He was fighting for his literal survival. He was backed into a corner, staring down the barrel of a ruined life, and he was willing to completely destroy my daughter to save himself. But Greg made one fatal miscalculation. He left a paper trail and he picked a fight with an auditor who never stops digging. I slowly reached over and printed out every single page of the internal compliance review. I printed the corporate registration documents for the dummy shell companies. I printed the forged checks with Grandma Ruby's perfect signature. I printed the medical care logs proving she was physically incapacitated on the exact dates those checks were written. And finally, I printed the routing numbers that proved Greg transferred stolen money from an elderly dementia patient directly into his personal crypto wallets. The printer hummed quietly in the corner of my office, spitting out the physical evidence of his total destruction page by page. I stacked the warm papers neatly on my desk, sliding them into a heavy, thick binder. I looked at the clock. It was 6 in the morning on a Friday. Greg had demanded that Aaliyah sign the relinquishment form by Friday afternoon. He thought the deadline and the frozen bank accounts would break our spirit. He thought we would come crawling to his office begging for mercy and offering the estate on a silver platter. Greg thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought his expensive suits and his corporate title made him invincible. He thought he could use his power to crush a single mother who audited hospital cafeterias. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the dynamic of our war. He thought he was the apex predator, hunting a weak, defenseless family. He did not realize that I was the one holding all the cards. He had built his entire fake luxury life on a fragile house of cards, and I was now holding the match that was going to burn it straight to the ground. The deadline was approaching, and I was not going to run away. I was not going to hide. I was going to let him walk right into his own trap, and I was going to lock the door behind him. I did not go to sleep. I shoved the thick binder of printed evidence into my leather briefcase, took a quick shower, and changed into my sharpest professional suit. By 7 in the morning, I was sitting in my car dialing a number I kept saved for absolute emergencies. I was not going to hire a standard family law attorney. Family lawyers are trained to mediate to find common ground and to encourage compromise. I did not want mediation. I wanted absolute total annihilation. I called Harrison Carter. Harrison is a ruthless, high-powered corporate litigator who represents the largest hospital networks in the state. I met him 3 years ago when my audit uncovered a massive embezzlement scheme run by a hospital administrator. Harrison was the attorney hired by the board to clean up the mess, and he used my financial paper trail to completely destroy the corrupt executive in federal court. Harrison is a shark in a custom suit, and he respects only 2 things in this world: cold, hard numbers and absolute leverage. I drove straight to his downtown office building. The receptionist tried to tell me he was booked for the next 3 weeks, but I bypassed her desk and walked directly into his glass-walled office. He looked up from his computer, ready to yell at whoever had interrupted him, but when he saw my face, he leaned back in his chair. He knew I would not show up unannounced unless millions of dollars were on the line. I dropped the heavy binder right in the center of his pristine desk. "I need you to look at a dead man walking," I said, simply, taking a seat across from him. Harrison opened the binder and began to read. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of pages. I watched his eyes scan the medical care logs, the forged checks, and the internal compliance report from Vanguard Wealth Management. When he finally reached the last page showing the $800,000 deficit in Greg's client accounts, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "This is not just elder abuse," Jasmine Harrison said, tapping the forged signatures. "This is felony wire fraud, grand larceny, and a blatant violation of federal securities law." Your brother-in-law is looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The SEC is going to skin him alive. I know, I replied, keeping my voice completely level. But he filed an emergency conservatorship yesterday to freeze my accounts. He is trying to starve me out and force my daughter to sign away her trust before the probate judge can actually look at the case. Harrison frowned, turning back to his computer keyboard. Let me check the county probate portal, he said, his fingers flying across the keys. A man this desperate is not going to just sit around and wait for Friday afternoon. He is going to try and force the issue. Harrison fell silent as he pulled up the active filings under my grandmother's estate. His eyes narrowed. You are right, Jasmine. He is trying to force the issue right now. Harrison turned his monitor so I could see the screen. Greg had not just filed the conservatorship. He had used a shadow legal maneuver to issue a mandatory arbitration summons for my 18-year-old daughter. He had scheduled a closed-door meeting for 1 o'clock this afternoon at the Vanguard corporate headquarters. The summons falsely claimed that Aaliyah had verbally agreed to surrender the assets, and that the meeting was just a formality to sign the final relinquishment papers in front of his firm's legal team. He is trying to corner her outside of a real courtroom, Harrison explained, his voice laced with professional disgust. He knows a judge would throw his conservatorship out the window the second they saw these forged checks, so he is bypassing the court entirely. He wants to drag your teenager into a boardroom, surround her with aggressive corporate lawyers, and emotionally terrorize her into signing the property over before anyone can verify his claims. Once she signs that paper, he can immediately liquidate the brownstone to pay back the clients he robbed. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, calculated fury settle into my bones. He thinks because my bank accounts are frozen, I will not be able to hire an attorney to stop this meeting, I said. He thinks Aaliyah will have to face them completely alone. Harrison closed the binder and pushed it back across the desk toward me. So what do you want to do, Jasmine? I can file a restraining order right now. I can call the police and have him arrested for the forgery before lunch. We can stop this meeting from ever happening. I placed my hand on the binder, feeling the weight of the evidence beneath my palms. I thought about the way Greg had smirked at me in the dining room. I thought about the way my mother had used her religion to manipulate my daughter. I thought about Chantel throwing wine in my face and calling me a bitter single mother. Getting Greg arrested quietly in his office was not enough. I needed my mother and my sister to watch his entire empire crumble. I needed the lawyers at his firm to see exactly what kind of criminal they were harboring. We are not going to cancel the meeting, I said, looking Harrison dead in the eye. We are going to let them set the trap. And then we are going to walk right into it. Harrison smiled, a genuine, terrifying shark smile. I will start drafting the countersuits, he said. Go get your daughter ready. I left the law office and drove straight back to my apartment. It was just past 10 in the morning. When I walked through the door, Aaliyah was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were a painful reminder of the emotional warfare my family had subjected her to. She had seen the email on her phone about the mandatory arbitration meeting, and the legal jargon had completely terrified her. Mom, what is arbitration? Aaliyah asked, her voice trembling as I sat down across from her. Uncle Greg sent me a message saying if I do not show up to his office at 1 o'clock, he is going to tell the police that you stole Grandma's money. He says he has lawyers waiting to finalize the transfer. Do we have to run away? I reached across the table and took both of her hands in mine. I squeezed them tightly, grounding her, passing my strength directly into her. We are not running anywhere, baby, I said firmly. I took a deep breath and laid everything out on the table. I did not treat her like a child. I treated her like the brilliant, resilient young woman she was. I explained exactly what I had found in the audit. I told her about the forged checks, the stolen crypto money, and the $800,000 debt Greg owed to his clients. I watched her eyes widen in shock as she realized that her polished, wealthy uncle was actually a desperate criminal on the verge of going to federal prison. He is not fighting for the family, Aaliyah, I explained, keeping my voice steady and calm. He is fighting for his freedom. He is using your grandmother and your Aunt Chantel as human shields. They think they are getting a house, but he is just going to sell it to pay off his stolen funds. Aaliyah swallowed hard, processing the massive betrayal. Why is he calling me to his office? She asked. Because he is a coward, I replied. He wants to drag you into a corporate boardroom and surround you with his fancy lawyers to make you feel small. He wants to bully you into signing the papers before a real judge can look at the evidence. He thinks because my bank accounts are frozen that I cannot fight back. He thinks you are just a naive teenager who will fold under pressure. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. A spark of anger finally began to replace the fear in her eyes. So what do we do? She asked. Do we just not show up? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the kitchen table. No. If we do not show up, he has time to scramble. He has time to create more fake documents or flee the state. I want to end this today permanently. But to do that, I need your help. I need you to be the bait. Aaliyah blinked, surprised by the request. What do you mean? I am going to drive you to Vanguard Wealth Management, I explained, laying out the strategy piece by piece. But I'm not going to walk into the boardroom with you right away. You are going to walk in there completely alone. Aaliyah's breath hitched, but she did not pull her hands away from mine. They need to think they have won, I continued. When you walk in there, I want you to play the exact part they expect you to play. Keep your shoulders slumped. Keep your eyes on the floor. Let my mother try to guilt-trip you. Let Chantel be as arrogant and smug as she wants. Let Greg puff out his chest and act like a corporate god. I want you to look terrified, Aaliyah. I want you to look like a broken, compliant teenager who is ready to surrender. Why would I do that? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Because we need Greg to feel so incredibly powerful and untouchable that he brings his firm's corporate lawyers into that room to witness your signature, I said. Right now, those lawyers think they are just facilitating a standard family property transfer. They have no idea Greg is using them to commit a federal crime. If Greg thinks you are alone and defeated, he will bring them into the boardroom to intimidate you. He will lock them into the room as his accomplices. And the moment he hands you that pen to sign away your inheritance, that is when I am going to walk through those doors and burn his entire world to the ground. I searched my daughter's face, waiting for her reaction. I was asking an 18-year-old girl to walk into a room full of emotional predators and hold the line. It was a terrifying request. But Aaliyah is my daughter. She carries my blood. She has watched me fight for every single thing we have ever owned, and she has watched me survive every insult my family ever threw at us. Aaliyah took a deep breath. She let go of my hands, sat up straight, and pulled her shoulders back. The scared little girl who had cried at the Sunday dinner table was completely gone. In her place sat a fierce, intelligent young woman who knew exactly what she was worth. "What should I wear?" she asked, her voice completely devoid of fear. I smiled, feeling a surge of absolute pride swell in my chest. "Wear the black dress you wore to Grandma's funeral," I told her. "Let them think you are still mourning. Let them think you are weak." While Aaliyah went to her room to get dressed, I walked back into my office. I took the massive binder of evidence and carefully separated the documents into 3 distinct color-coded folders. The red folder contained the medical receipts proving I was the primary creditor to the estate. The blue folder contained the forged checks and the proof of the crypto market crash. The black folder contained the internal compliance review showing Greg's $800,000 embezzlement from his own clients. One for the lawyers, one for the police, one for the IRS. As I zipped the folders into my leather briefcase, my cell phone began to ring on the desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Brenda was calling to gloat. She was calling to deliver the final psychological blow before the meeting, ensuring that I knew my place. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. "Hello, Jasmine," Brenda said, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet condescension she used when she felt she was entirely in control. "I am just calling to make sure Aaliyah is on her way downtown. Greg was very generous to arrange this private meeting so we can handle family business quietly, without the police getting involved in your little fraud investigation." I listened to her breathe, congratulating herself on her brilliant victory. "I really suggest you stay home, Jasmine." Brenda continued, sighing heavily into the receiver. "You have done enough damage to this family. Let the educated adults handle the estate from here on out. Aaliyah will be safe with us. We will make sure she gets a small allowance for her dorm room after the paperwork is finalized. It is the best outcome for everyone. I did not scream at her. I did not call her a liar. I simply looked at the heavy leather briefcase sitting on my desk, smiled a cold, dead smile into the phone, and spoke with perfect, terrifying clarity. "Do not worry, Mom," I said softly. "I will stay completely out of your way. I will let Greg handle exactly what he deserves." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I grabbed my car keys, picked up my briefcase, and walked out into the living room where Aaliyah was waiting by the front door. It was 12:15 in the afternoon. We had exactly 45 minutes to get downtown. My family thought they had cornered a lamb for the slaughter. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited a lion into their house. The drive down the interstate was a straight shot into the heart of the city financial district. I kept the car radio completely off. The silence inside the vehicle was thick, but it was not the anxious, heavy silence we had shared after my mother's disastrous Sunday dinner. It was the focused, electric quiet of two women preparing for absolute war. I glanced over at the passenger seat. Aaliyah was staring out the window at the passing skyline. She was wearing the simple black dress she had worn to Grandma Ruby's funeral, exactly like I had asked her to. The dark fabric made her look small and fragile, but the set of her jaw told a completely different story. She was no longer the terrified girl who had cried at the dining room table. She was a weapon, and she was ready to be deployed. As I navigated through the heavy downtown traffic, my mind briefly flashed back to the phone call I had received from my mother just moments before we left the apartment. Brenda had called me to gloat. She had spoken with that sickeningly sweet, condescending tone she reserved for when she felt entirely victorious. She had actually told me to stay home and let the educated adults handle the estate. She had told me I had done enough damage to the family and that Aaliyah would be safe with them. The sheer delusion required to make that phone call was staggering. My mother truly believed she had won. She believed that freezing my bank accounts had broken my spirit. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy practicing her victory speech, I was organizing the forensic financial evidence that was going to send her favorite son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I did not argue with her on the phone. I did not scream. I just smiled, agreed, and hung up. There is absolutely no point in warning a predator that they are walking into a trap. We pulled into the visitor parking garage of the Vanguard Wealth Management corporate headquarters. The building was a massive, towering structure of dark-tinted glass and cold steel. It was designed specifically to intimidate. It was designed to make anyone standing outside of its walls feel incredibly small and insignificant. Greg loved this building because it was a physical manifestation of his own bloated ego. He thought working on the 42nd floor made him a god. He was about to find out that gravity works the exact same way no matter how high up you sit. I parked the car, and we took the elevator up to the main ground floor lobby. The lobby was an expanse of white marble and polished chrome. Men in expensive tailored suits and women holding designer briefcases rushed past us. I stopped Aaliyah behind a large decorative marble pillar, completely out of sight from the main security desk. We went over the plan one final time. I held both of her shoulders and looked directly into her deep brown eyes. "I need you to walk up to that security desk alone," I told her, keeping my voice low and steady. "Tell them you are here for the arbitration meeting with Greg. They will send you up to the 42nd floor. When you walk into that boardroom, I want you to look at the floor. I want you to keep your shoulders slumped. Let my mother try to manipulate you. Let Chantel be as arrogant and vicious as she wants. Let Greg puff out his chest and act like he owns the entire world." Aaliyah nodded, swallowing hard. "What if he tries to force me to sign the paper before you get there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He will not force you immediately," I promised her. "Men like Greg do not just want to win, they want to perform. He is going to give a whole speech about how powerful he is. He is going to try to terrorize you with legal jargon. Just let him talk, Aaliyah. Let him dig his own grave. And remember that no matter what they say to you in that room, you are completely safe because I will be standing right on the other side of those doors, She took a deep breath, letting the air out slowly. "I can do this," she said. "I know you can," I replied. "Now go." I stepped back into the shadows of the marble pillar and watched my 18-year-old daughter turn around and walk toward the security desk. She looked so young, standing next to the massive glass security barriers. I watched her hand over her identification to the guard. I watched the guard print her a temporary visitor badge. I watched her walk through the gleaming metal turnstiles entirely alone. It took every single ounce of my maternal instinct not to sprint across the lobby, grab her hand, and pull her out of that building. Throwing your own child to the wolves goes against every natural protective urge in a mother's body, but I knew this was the only way to expose the full extent of their corruption. I had to let the wolves bare their teeth so I could snap their jaws permanently. I waited in the lobby for exactly 12 minutes. I sat on a sleek leather bench and opened my heavy leather briefcase one last time to review my ammunition. Inside the briefcase were 3 thick, color-coded folders. I ran my fingers over the edge of the red folder. Inside were the hundreds of pages of medical receipts and bank transfers, proving that I was the sole financial provider for Grandma Ruby's memory care. This folder was for the corporate lawyers. It proved I was the primary creditor to the estate and that Greg had absolutely no legal standing to bypass me. I touched the blue folder. Inside were the copies of the 12 canceled checks featuring Grandma Ruby's perfectly forged signature alongside the medical logs, proving she was physically incapacitated on those exact dates. This folder was for the police. It was the undeniable proof of felony elder abuse and wire fraud. Finally, I touched the black folder. Inside was the highly confidential internal compliance review from Vanguard Wealth Management, detailing the $800,000 Greg had embezzled from his own high-net-worth clients and lost in a spectacular cryptocurrency crash. This folder was for the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was the nail in the coffin. I closed the briefcase and locked the brass clasps. The soft click echoed in the busy lobby. It was 12:55. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles out of my professional gray suit, and walked directly to the security desk. I showed my identification and told the guard I was the legal executor of the estate joining the arbitration meeting on the 42nd floor. My name was already on the legal mandate. The guard printed my badge without a second glance and pointed me toward the express elevators. The ride up to the 42nd floor was completely silent. I watched the digital numbers above the door climb higher and higher. 30, 35, 40. My heart was beating a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I was not nervous. I was filled with a cold, calculated fury. When the elevator doors slid open, the executive floor was an ocean of plush gray carpet and frosted glass walls. It smelled like expensive espresso and corporate arrogance. I walked past the empty reception desk, moving completely silently down the long corridor. I did not ask for directions. I followed the sound of the voices. I stopped outside the heavy mahogany doors of the main boardroom. I stood perfectly still, pressing my shoulder against the wall. Through the thick wood, I could hear the trap snapping shut just like I knew it would. I heard Chantel's sharp voice complaining that Aaliyah was acting like a stubborn child. I heard my mother Brenda deploying her weaponized guilt, telling Aaliyah that I had ruined the family reputation and that she needed to do the Christian thing to save her grandmother's house. And then I heard Greg. I heard his low, menacing register filling the room. I heard the heavy thud of his legal binder hitting the glass table. I heard him threaten my 18-year-old daughter, telling her he would personally tie the estate up in probate court for the next 10 years. I heard him promise to freeze every single asset and drain her college fund entirely with legal fees if she did not sign the relinquishment form right that second. He had done exactly what I needed him to do. He had brought his corporate lawyers into the room. He had made his extortion explicit. He had handed my daughter the pen. The timeline had finally caught up to the present moment. The time for waiting and planning was officially over. I reached down and gripped the cold brass handle of the boardroom door. I took one final breath, prepared to drop the receipts, and kicked the doors wide open. The heavy oak doors slammed against the glass walls of the boardroom with a thunderous crash. Every single head in the room snapped toward me. I walked straight past my mother, Brenda, who was shrinking back into her oversized leather chair. I walked past my sister, Chantel, who dropped her phone onto the glass table in shock. I walked directly to the head of the polished mahogany table where Greg stood, flanked by his three intimidating corporate lawyers. My daughter Aaliyah looked up at me, and the pure, profound relief in her eyes fueled the fire in my chest. I lifted my massive binder of financial audits and dropped it squarely on top of Greg's pristine legal documents. The heavy thud echoed in the dead quiet room. I reached over, picked up the gold pen he had just shoved into my daughter's trembling hand and calmly clicked it shut. Before my daughter signs away a $3 million estate, I said, my voice perfectly level, "Let us talk about the $140,000 of Grandma's money that you embezzled last year, Greg." The room went completely still. Greg's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. A thick drop of sweat formed at his hairline and rolled down his temple. The three corporate lawyers exchanged confused and deeply alarmed glances. But I did not stop there. I did not just hand them a stack of papers and expect them to read. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I walked over to the podium at the front of the room, grabbed the presentation cable, and plugged it directly into my computer. The massive 80-inch flat-screen monitor mounted on the boardroom wall flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright light over my family. Greg finally snapped out of his paralysis and lunged forward. "You cannot do this, Jasmine," he stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "This is a private corporate meeting. Turn that screen off right now." I ignored him completely. I tapped my keyboard, and the first slide of my financial presentation illuminated the dark room. "Welcome to the actual reading of the estate," I announced. The first document that flashed onto the 80-inch screen was a meticulously organized spreadsheet detailing 4 years of medical invoices from Grandma Ruby's memory care facility. Right next to the invoices were the corresponding bank transfer receipts directly from my personal checking account. I looked at Chantel, who was staring at the screen with her mouth hanging wide open. "For the last 4 years, Mom has told everyone in our church that the two of you were paying for Grandma's private nurses," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the boardroom. She built her entire reputation on that lie. "But the bank records do not care about your reputation. The facility costs $6,000 a month, and neither of you ever contributed a single dime. Every single payment came directly from my savings. I paid $288,000 out of my own pocket to keep our grandmother safe while you bought designer handbags, Chantel." My mother, Brenda, jumped out of her chair, her face flushed with extreme embarrassment and rage. "How dare you air family business in front of strangers?" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger at me. "I made sacrifices for this family. I gave up everything to raise you girls. You are just being spiteful to steal the house." I pressed the spacebar on my laptop. The slide transitioned instantly. "You are not getting the house, Mom," I replied coldly, "because as the sole financial provider for the deceased, I am legally the primary creditor to the estate. Even if Greg somehow won his ridiculous emergency conservatorship, the estate owes me nearly $300,000. I can legally bankrupt the property and force a liquidation sale before either of you sees a single penny." Brenda gasped, collapsing back into her chair, holding her chest. But I was just getting started. I clicked to the next slide. 2 documents appeared side by side, dominating the massive screen. On the left were 12 canceled checks from Grandma Ruby's personal checking account, totaling exactly $140,000. On the right were the certified daily medical logs from the nursing staff. "What you are looking at is felony forgery," I explained, pacing slowly across the front of the room. Greg wrote these 12 checks to his own high-risk crypto investment firm. Notice the perfect cursive signature on the bottom line. Now look at the medical logs from the exact same dates. I read the nursing notes aloud, emphasizing every single word. "Patient is suffering from advanced cognitive disorientation and is currently in a medically induced coma following a severe seizure. Patient cannot move her hands." I looked at Brenda and Chantel, who were both staring at Greg in absolute horror. They were greedy and manipulative, but they had absolutely no idea he had actually stolen from a dying woman. Grandma Ruby was in a coma, Chantel, I said softly but firmly. She did not sign those checks. Your husband forged her signature and robbed her blind. Greg was physically shaking now. His chest heaved as he frantically looked at the door, calculating his escape. But the trap was already fully sprung. I turned my back on my family and focused my absolute attention on the three corporate lawyers who were standing frozen at the side of the mahogany table. I unzipped my briefcase and pulled out the blue and black color-coded folders I had prepared earlier that morning. I walked around the table and handed a set of folders to the lead attorney. He took them hesitantly, his eyes darting between me and the terrified junior partner. I strongly suggest you open the black folder, counselor, I said, my voice dropping into a tone of absolute professional authority. Inside, you will find a highly confidential internal compliance review from your own firm, Vanguard Wealth Management. It details exactly how your junior partner, Greg, secretly embezzled $800,000 from his high-net-worth clients over the last 3 years. The lead attorney opened the black folder. His eyes scanned the first page and his face went completely rigid. I clicked to the final slide on the projector. It displayed the catastrophic crash of the crypto portfolios where Greg had dumped the stolen client funds alongside Grandma's money. Greg did not invite you here today to mediate a family property dispute, I announced, projecting my voice so it echoed off the glass walls. He is completely bankrupt. He has until the end of the month to replace the $800,000 he stole from your clients, or Vanguard is turning him over to the federal authorities. He brought you into this room to bully my 18-year-old daughter into signing away her inheritance so he could instantly sell her historic brownstone and pay back the money he embezzled. He brought you here to be unwitting accomplices to felony wire fraud and grand larceny. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. The lead attorney slowly closed the black folder. He did not look at Greg. He did not ask Greg for an explanation. As a seasoned corporate lawyer, he knew instantly that the documents I handed him were authentic internal audit reports. He knew that his own legal license, his career, and his freedom were now in direct jeopardy simply because he had stepped into this room to assist a desperate criminal. The lead attorney turned to his two associates and gave a single sharp nod. Without saying a single word to my brother-in-law, the three lawyers snapped their briefcases shut. They turned on their heels and walked straight out of the boardroom, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind them. They abandoned Greg, completely isolating him in his own spectacular ruin. Greg lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the glass table to keep himself from collapsing, his knees literally buckling beneath him. Chantel backed away from him as if he were suddenly highly contagious, her hands covering her mouth in pure, unfiltered shock as the reality of her fake luxury lifestyle crumbled into dust. Brenda sat frozen in her leather chair, staring blankly at the massive screen displaying the undeniable proof of their total destruction. I walked over to the table, picked up my daughter's canvas tote bag, and handed it to her. We were done here. The fallout from the boardroom meeting was swift and absolutely brutal. I did not even have to lift another finger to watch Greg's entire fake empire collapse into dust. We walked out of that glass building, left the city financial district, and went back to our quiet lives, while the bomb I had detonated tore his reality apart. Within 48 hours, Vanguard Wealth Management conducted a massive internal forensic audit. The senior partners verified every single page of the compliance report I had handed them. Corporate loyalty only goes so far, and when federal securities violations and stolen client funds are involved, these firms will not hesitate to cut the dead weight to protect themselves from massive liability. They immediately terminated Greg's employment, locked him out of the corporate network, and turned his files directly over to the federal authorities. 2 days later, Greg was arrested at his luxury downtown condo. There were no more expensive custom suits and no more arrogant smirks. He was escorted out of his pristine, high-rise building in handcuffs, facing multiple federal charges for wire fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement. The federal judge denied him bail, considering him an extreme flight risk, given his missing $800,000. He was traded from a corner office on the 42nd floor to a concrete federal holding cell. But the destruction did not stop with Greg. The moment the federal investigation was launched, all of Greg and Chantel's shared assets were completely frozen and subsequently seized by the government in a desperate attempt to pay back the stolen client funds. Chantel's perfectly curated fake luxury lifestyle evaporated literally overnight. The bank repossessed her leased Range Rover right out of her private parking garage. Her high-limit credit cards were instantly declined at the grocery store. The designer handbags, the expensive clothes, and the extravagant jewelry she loved to flaunt online were all seized by authorities as assets purchased with embezzled money. Panicked, entirely broke, and facing total social humiliation, Chantel packed whatever she could carry in trash bags and tried to move back into our mother's house. She expected Brenda to welcome her with open arms and fund her life just like she always had. But Chantel arrived to find a bright yellow foreclosure notice permanently nailed to Brenda's front door. Brenda was completely ruined. Without the ability to steal Grandma Ruby's estate, she had absolutely no way to pay the massive second mortgage she had secretly taken out to fund Chantel's ridiculous destination wedding in Cabo. The bank formally began the eviction process, giving her 30 days to vacate the property she had lived in for 3 decades. Worse still, the rumors of what had happened at the law office had spread rapidly through our community. When Brenda's church friends found out that she had conspired to steal from her own mother while she was lying helpless in a memory care facility, they entirely turned their backs on her. The pastor refused to take her calls. The women who used to praise her devotion now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over her pristine public image was now a complete social pariah, living out of cardboard boxes in a house the bank legally owned. Brenda tried to call me, of course. She left dozens of voicemails sobbing and begging for forgiveness, asking if she could move into the brownstone with Aaliyah just until she got back on her feet. I deleted every single message without listening to the end and permanently blocked her number. With nowhere else to go and absolutely no marketable skills to fall back on, Chantel was finally forced to enter the real world. The 38-year-old golden child with a master's degree who had not worked a real job in 6 years had to aggressively apply for minimum wage retail positions just to survive. She ended up working as a register associate at a mid-tier clothing boutique at the local mall. It was the exact same boutique she used to loudly mock on her social media pages for selling cheap clothes to poor people. Now she spends 40 hours a week standing on her feet folding polyester shirts and wearing a mandatory plastic name tag while she completely hides her face whenever someone from her old internet life walks into the store. While my mother and sister faced the brutal reality of their own greed, Aaliyah and I walked into the county probate court to officially settle the estate. It was a remarkably short hearing. The probate judge took one look at the certified medical logs and the forged checks Greg had submitted, and he was absolutely disgusted. The judge dismissed Greg's emergency conservatorship petition immediately with extreme prejudice. He formally cleared my name of any alleged wrongdoing and finalized the execution of the trust exactly as Grandma Ruby had intended. Aaliyah took full legal ownership of the historic brownstone. The property was transferred seamlessly into her trust, ensuring that it would remain a permanent foundation for her future. The liquid assets and the vintage jewelry were secured, fully funding her college tuition through her senior year and beyond. As we walked through the empty parlor of the brownstone, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, I watched my daughter breathe a sigh of absolute relief. She will never have to take out a massive student loan. She will never have to beg a toxic family member for a place to sleep. She is stepping into her adult life completely debt-free and protected by the incredible generational wealth our grandmother built from the ground up. As I stood with Aaliyah on the front porch, holding the heavy brass keys in my hand, I reflected on everything it took to reach this moment. For 18 years, my family mistook my teenage pregnancy for weakness. They looked at a 17-year-old girl holding a baby and decided I was a failure. They decided I was the permanent family scapegoat who could be endlessly bullied, dismissed, and controlled. They poured all their praise and their stolen resources into Chantel simply because she knew how to play the game and wear the right clothes. But they fundamentally failed to understand how the world actually works. Having a child at 17 did not make me weak. It stripped away my innocence and forced me to build a spine made of pure steel. It taught me how to work 12-hour hospital shifts while studying for my financial exams. It taught me how to stretch a dollar and how to spot a predator from a mile away. Most importantly, it taught me how to fight the entire world to protect the person I loved. They thought they could use psychological manipulation and weaponized church guilt to steal from my daughter. They thought they could use aggressive corporate lawyers to terrify us into submission. But I broke the generational curse of their financial abuse. I did not yell. I did not cry. I used cold, hard numbers to permanently dismantle their empire of lies, and I secured my daughter's future in the process. I never lost my swing. Have you ever had to use cold, hard receipts to destroy a family member's lies? Let me know in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic families.